Montreal's theatre, Thesry Lunia, has a new play coming out next week, March 14th. The play, The Chemical Valley Project, is produced by Broadleaf Theatre, a company based in Toronto, and looks into the issue of environmental racism in Sarnia, Ontario. I am talking to Kevin Matthew Wong today to chat about his inspiration for this production, how he has worked with Indigenous activists Vanessa and BZ Gray, and more about the role of documentary theater in our world today. Hi, Kevin. Thank you so much for joining me today to chat about your new theater production, The Chemical Valley Project.
It's great to be here, Neha. Thanks so much for having me.
So I'd love to just dive in and get started. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got interested in the Chemical Valley and Sarnia? Like, what drew you to that topic and the theme?
About 10 years ago, I started a theater company with a few friends, and we were trying to talk about environmental issues in Canada. And a couple years into that journey, I realized that our work was feeling really hollow to me. Something really critical was missing in our perspective, and it was totally my ignorance. I didn't know what it was. And then I thought about it more deeply, and I realized that it's a little bit absurd for us to be running an environmental theater company in the context of Canada without any collaborators, deep collaborators that are Indigenous and that bring Indigenous knowledge and perspectives to the work. Um, and During that time, I stumbled upon this topic of the Chemical Valley. So these two activists named Vanessa and BZ Gray, who are amazing water protectors, land defenders, and siblings, they were leading these tours around the community of Amjanong, their community, which is surrounded by Canada's petrochemical industry. And by chance, a friend of mine invited me to visit Amjanong with them on that tour. And the tours were taking place at that time on these school buses. So Vanessa would lead a school bus, BZ would lead a school bus. And I was sitting in one of these buses, just thinking about how every Canadian needs to be here right now. And this bus can't possibly fit, 30 million people. But that I would love for more people to engage with these two incredible people. And I also thought, if I'm going to take up space in this experience, then I have some responsibility to do something about the learnings that I'm getting from this experience, which were really profound, hearing directly from Vanessa and BZ. So after that, I asked Vanessa if she thought that theater might be, a platform that could support their activism. And Vanessa agreed to a first meeting, and we really hit it off. And since that first meeting with Vanessa and BZ, which you actually experienced in the theater show, we've been collaborating for 8 years now in multiple iterations of this show, trying to get the message across around Vanessa and BZ's activism and to encourage Canadians to interrogate their own place in Canada and where they should put their solidarity, which is with Indigenous nations and water protectors, land defenders.
That's incredible. I'm curious to know, like, what was that experience like when you first went to Sarnia to see it? Because that sounds like it quite had like a profound impact on you. I mean, what did you see? What struck you the most?
It definitely did. So before I went on the Toxic tour, I was able to watch some documentaries and read some articles, and it was pretty abstract. You know,
Mhm.
it was very mainly it was quite academic. The information that I'd gotten before, and it was statistical and it was numbers. But going there and seeing that the old preschool is across the street from one of the largest factories in the
Mm.
area, and then smelling the smells and seeing the the smoke that was coming out of these factories fall onto the car, as we were
Mm.
driving around. All of those sensations were so provocative, evocative, and I really thought this is an experience that is going to change my life, and that I think just conveying some of that experience felt important to me as an artist.
Mhm. Did you find that when you talked to people about it, they sort of knew what was happening there, but not to the extent like you did, or many people didn't? Because I remember hearing about Sarnia's Chemical Valley in And the people that live there almost kind of joke about it because it's absurd how drastic the situation is, and so hearing about it as well, you sort of brush it off. How did you find people around you with their knowledge about this?
Yeah. I found that generally people were not aware of the issue. Um, Most people are quite surprised learning about it. I'm a Torontonian, and Sarnia is about 3 hours away from me, and I'd never heard about this topic before I visited Amjanong and learned about the toxic tours that Vanessa and Beezy were leading. And I think you're right. The people that are aware of it, especially folks from the Sarnia Lambton County area, sometimes are a bit tongue in cheek about it, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we live in the this toxic corridor or whatever." Yeah, it's a really interesting attitude that I find. I think folks that are aware and folks that feel particularly connected to the public health impacts of it in the community are particularly concerned and engaged
Hmm.
for sure.
I want to ask about like your intentions when you started the theater company, because you said that you knew you wanted to be engaging with the themes of environmentalism. Like, how did you picture that? What kind of topics were you initially keen on it, and has that changed in the last 8 years?
Yeah, so we were definitely very young and keen when the company started. And at that time, Vines were a thing. Now it's TikTok. Back then it was Vines, right? So 6-second videos. And I was a theater student at the University of Toronto. And I was lucky enough to be able to see work in the city by professionals because we were located downtown. And I was really frustrated that the professional work that I was seeing in the city of Toronto was either not engaging with climate at all, or when it did, it was extremely caricatured. It was, you know, sometimes pedantic. It was sometimes just, ridiculously oversimplified. No connection to actual people who were doing the work in the climate community either. It was deeply dissatisfying. And
Mm.
this comes from, before I was a university student, I was a high school student that was splitting their time between the drama room and the environmental club. Every day after school, I was in one of those two rooms. And so I really wanted to find a way to connect those two worlds for a long time. And the reason why I brought up Vines is because I thought that with our generation, I wanted to be specific about an audience. And I thought, we're young people, we want to be speaking to young people as well. At that time, I thought succinctness was really going to be part of how we get a message across. So our first play ever was actually 20 plays in 60 minutes because we thought there were so many topics to discuss and that young people were used to receiving knowledge in a quick, pithy kind of way. So we tackled topics as, diverse as the nuclear power plant in Pickering using documentary media to we did a 80s aerobics video through time that went from the Big Bang and cave people all the way to the Industrial Revolution and the climate catastrophe that we're in. So for us, there's always been this the thing that's burning underneath all the work is how do we communicate and how do we energize an audience that we think is already engaged in these issues, is already concerned. So our job
Mhm.
isn't, I feel that our job isn't to just inform. I think we're creating work for people that are already informed, already hoping to engage or already have. And we're
Mhm.
either encouraging them to keep going or to take that first action to get involved.
Mhm. Right. Like you're not talking down to them in any way about, explaining them the ABCs or something, but meeting them at eye level and kind of being real with them.
Yeah, and I think when we start with that foundation of the audience is intelligent, is it involves people living in the world as it is today, then we can really get deeper into things that are unsaid that we're not speaking about.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's the feeling aspects of things, and for this, it was really one goal of ours was to humanize Vanessa and Beezy for people who may only see them in um, in the news, in articles. Um, Maybe and at the beginning when we started this show, some people only knew Vanessa from this dramatic political action that Vanessa took, in which she bike locked herself to a pipeline valve. And we
Mm,
really wanted to acknowledge the fact that for some people, they would see that as really extreme, and that they wouldn't exercise um, that sort of empathy reflex immediately, you know.
mhm,
That's also what the show is trying to do.
mhm, absolutely. When you talked about when you were a student seeing other professional productions and the gap within them, was that other theater productions you meant
Yeah,
specifically?
it was
Okay.
definitely other productions.
What about it was unsatisfactory to you? Like, what did you think was the problem with them?
Yeah, without getting too specific about which productions, I would say
Yeah.
maybe two things that I'll point to. One is a kind of um, abstract version of what a climate engaged person is. Like there's a lot of, characters that are seem very out of touch that were being depicted at that time, who were people involved in the climate. I think they were depicted as a lot of experts that were just out of touch with people. That seemed to be a trope at that time. And then so the stories would really revolve around, that as a main character flaw. um,
Hmm.
I thought that was pretty dissatisfying when we all need to be engaged in this topic, and we need to be depicting people who are actually um, that we can, relate to and empathize with and see ourselves as.
Hmm.
Uh, so I thought there was a lot of distance there. And then the other thing was lack of indigenous perspectives.
Mm,
I saw a show in which the the piece alluded to the fact that there were no indigenous perspectives in it in a way that I
mm,
thought was very deeply disingenuous and dissatisfying. And it
mhm,
was a very widely circulated piece. It was one of the most aggravating things for me. And I thought we cannot make a piece that does that.
mhm. You mean it was pointing a finger to itself in the fact that it didn't have indigenous perspective, but it was a bit of a cop out in a way.
Absolutely.
Okay,
It
I
seemed
see.
as if it was trying to absolve itself. And the thing that I also acknowledge in the show is this fear of engaging with indigenous peoples, like people specifically, and then by extension that means indigenous relations, which is such
Mhm,
a shame. Like I think
mhm,
really there's people need to get over themselves, especially artists, to make real relationships with people. And
mhm,
it seemed to me that, and I recognized in myself that I was encountering a lot of this fear, and it actually is one scene in the show acknowledges that, am I the right voice to be engaging with this topic? And I was just frustrated that I felt like the rigor that was put into other places in those dramatic productions weren't actually being put into the real world research that I would think you would want to do that would precede making a production like that. And that would include involving indigenous perspectives.
mhm. You mean like the effort that's going into dramatic productions is kind of pushing aside the research and engaging in the indigenous perspectives?
I think so. At that time,
Mhm,
with the pieces that I was seeing, that's what I felt, and that's why the
mhm,
Chemical Valley Project is specifically created, where Vanessa and Beezy are not only appearing in the show in documentary media, but they're also our dramaturgs on the.
mhm. Why do you think people stray away from that? You said there's sort of a fear or um, like resistance to be engaging with indigenous folks. Why do you think that is, especially in the artistic world?
Yeah, well, I think it has to do with, well, it's very personal. I think these barriers. For one, it's definitely racism. Like I think for me, I had an interesting experience. So when I was in university, I was a tour guide, and I was a tour guide for six different cities, one of which is Montreal, and one of which is Toronto. So I would lead these teenagers on these tours throughout these cities. And at the end of my 6 years of doing it, I led groups from all over Canada, every single province. And most of the time, actually, I may be the only or first East Asian person, surprisingly. And this was like 10, 12 years ago, that these teenagers would be engaging with for a prolonged amount of time. And I recognized when I met those young people that in the first few moments, I had to dispel a lot of preconceived notions about what somebody like me would present as, how we would speak, what we would, be interested in, et cetera, whether or not we would be relatable. And I guess my subconscious and conscious acknowledgement of the ways that I'm seen helps me empathize with one people who are stuck in a certain way of seeing other people, and two that it's not sometimes it's not the message, it's the way that it's packaged, which is sad, in some
Hmm.
ways. That's why I thought that this theater piece, my strength as a performer, I think, is all of that honing of, you know, one being vulnerable with an audience, but also trying to win them over, that I really honed with those teenagers over 6 years. I think I'm using a lot of those skills again. Um, but yeah, I hope that answers your question. I think there's a
Yeah.
fear. I think there's a fear, and yeah.
That must have been such an interesting experience.
Oh, the
Especially
tour guiding.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Especially teenagers are a bit ruthless sometimes.
And I think what was really great about working with young people is they're not lying to you. Like, theater audiences and our friends in the arts, they kind of don't want to hurt your feelings, or I feel like I'm always trying to coax out of people, what did you actually think, because I actually want to know. Some people don't actually want to know. um Teenagers are not going to um lie to you,
No,
they're going to tell you
they'll
straight up.
tell you they think you suck straight to your
Yeah,
face.
and they won't give you the time of day. So I think that you
No.
could really get a sense of what engagement feels like, I
Mm,
got
that's super interesting. I want to ask you a bit, Kevin, about your work with Vanessa and BZ on this project, like how you collaborated with them. And I thought it was really interesting what you mentioned earlier about people don't really see activists as real people or and humanizing activists. So yeah, if you could talk a little bit about what your collaboration with them for this piece was like, and how you were seeking to humanize them as activists.
yeah. So Vanessa and Beezy have been the heart of this piece since the beginning. So the show started with a conversation that we had at a cafe outside, um, and we were really just kind of spitballing. What could theater do to augment the incredible efforts that Vanessa and Beezy are taking in their everyday lives? Um, and we had a lot of conversation about what the form is going to be, what sorts of stories we'll tell. We've probably been through, I would guess, 60 hours of documentary recording between the three of us over the
Mm.
years that we've put together this show, maybe more. So that first conversation led to um, many trips to Amjanong, led to volunteering for the Toxic Tour, from being a guest one year to many years later being a co-collaborator there, like helping out with checking guests in and like helping with food service, or all those things. Um, and it really blossomed from us being, I would say, my relationship to Vanessa and Beezy is kind of a, for lack of a better word, them as a subject to start, to them as real collaborators on the project, and now we're friends. And as the relationship matured, I think what you experience on stage is also a more mature relationship between us. Um, but yeah, they've really been in it from the beginning. And back when we were chatting about form, I had explained some of the shows that I'd seen recently, and that I don't want to replicate that with this. And Beezy said in that first conversation, "Well, Kevin, like, are you gonna wear a wig to play Vanessa? Like, like." And that goes to show some of the absurdity of some of the ideas, some of the forms that we play with in documentary too. Like, this topic is too real for this community. It's too real for these two activists. It would it we very early on said the forum is probably not another actor coming in and saying the words of NSNBC. It's not the right forum for us.
Yeah, I'm wondering about how I guess it's because I haven't seen it yet. But I'm wondering how the production sort of humanizes them.
Yeah,
Like, how does it look like? How do their stories play out in it?
yeah. I think the big thing that I am excited about is that the production allows people to spend time with these two. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
they're not there on stage with me, but um,
Mm.
it's a much deeper engagement than if you just read an article.
Right.
And what I really appreciate in the form of documentary media and documentary theater, and particularly having recorded the actual conversations that we had, is the tone
Mm-hmm.
that we have with each other as
Mm-hmm.
friends, as collaborators. Um, what is interesting about the show as well that Vanessa and BZ say they appreciate is some of these stories are very difficult to tell,
Mm-hmm.
and retelling them is runs the risk of re-traumatizing them with these
Mm-hmm.
stories. And what the show does is it allows these stories to be amplified and shared without them having to do the labor of resharing these stories everywhere that we go and with every audience that we share with. So, I
Mm-hmm.
think it's also a interesting thing that we're modeling kind of sharing the burden of these stories as
Mm-hmm.
settler allies and indigenous activists, you know,
Mm-hmm.
um, and speaking to the communities for which we have the spoons in modern lingo to communicate with. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, I think that's one really important aspect. And there's you get to feel their personality, and there's laughter in the piece. You not only see some of the more dramatic political actions that they take, but you also get that more personal side of
Mm-hmm.
how they joke with me, what we're chatting about, how they talk about themselves in a deep way. That's not just about their activism. That's really about the whole picture of them as people.
Mm-hmm. Were you always interested in documentary theater?
No, no, I wasn't. So I trained as an actor, and
Mm.
we did a verbatim unit, and I so struggled with listening to somebody's voice and trying to emulate every single thing to the T. Because at that time that was in on Vogue, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what I was attracted to in documentary theater, my version of documentary theater, this version of documentary theater, is a playfulness with reality. That's what I found
Mm-hmm.
really interesting. When you're trying to ask an audience to carry something into the outside world from this very mediated space of the theater, that's what I
Mm-hmm.
find very exciting about documentaries. There's that you're you have to be conscious of the fact that we're playing with reality in the piece in a way
Mm-hmm.
that a Shakespeare doesn't really ask you to do that so much by default.
Right. You kind of leave your sense of reality at the door
Yeah, yeah.
when you walk in.
There's
Yeah.
less disbelief suspending, in
Mm-hmm.
this film. Yeah.
You said that you found some sort of gaps in the current documentary theater scene, and I'm wondering what does that look like for you? What do you want to fill in that space with the works that you produce?
Yeah, I hope I don't get in trouble for anything that I say, but you know, I think that what really motivates me is integrity within my own work. I think that I'm certain that the works that may seem dissatisfying to me, I hope feel that they have full integrity to the artist that created them. Um, so I think that the form that Canadians have been playing with a lot is verbatim, primarily, which is when you record audio or video interview with somebody, and then an actor takes on that role and plays that person. Um, for me, most of the time, that work feels a bit extractive, and what I don't like about the limitations generally of the way that we make theater in terms of the money that we have to do it and who's involved early on is those performers aren't often the ones who are doing the interviewing. They're not the ones who are receiving it. What's really special, I think, about being a performer creator and researcher interviewer is you were revisiting the feeling of receiving, and I think that it's a bit abstract. Like, it's just, even if you're just hearing the audio, it's not the full experience of engaging with the person and understanding them and feeling your relationship with them, like, that's, for me, that's so foundational to this show in particular. And it's so clear to me that when we there is a world in which we can use documentary media, I think, effectively, and in a way, and verbatim, I mean, in a way that abstracts things a bit, but it would not have worked for this story. I'll say that much. And I think for topics that have there's maybe some places that it's working very well. I'm waiting to feel like incredibly engaged by a piece like that, but that form for me, especially when the creators at their heart are talking about issues that are really important and really deeply affect the people that are depicted on stage. I don't fully find that quite satisfying yet. So I'll say that much maybe.
Hmm. Did you face any challenges when trying to form this piece and trying to find the right um, shape that would fit the story?
What's really delightful for us was we had no resources when we started. It sounds bad. It sounds really bad. But we were fresh out of school. We were our initial set piece was a shelf that our friend found off the street. And it was a sheet that I recycled from another show. Is the main projection surface of this show, and a school bus. Remember when I said that we did a show about the Pickering nuclear plant? There's a little toy school bus that was used from that show that's in this show now. All of these. It was actually, there was a ton of creative restraints because we didn't have the resources. That really, that's how we got started. Um, in terms of time, what was also a creative restraint was Vanessa had these legal charges against her, and it spurred a sense of urgency in us because we wanted to create a show that could speak to as many people as quickly as possible. So we started out with a 10-minute piece. This play was actually 10 minutes to begin. It was most of the factual stuff only, just to get people informed about the topic. And then eventually people said, well, we really want to learn more because that was really engaging for 10 minutes, but like, you're really leaving us on a cliffhanger. So we made it 20 minutes. And I was still trying to be as objective as possible. And then people were like, okay, but like, what's this Chinese guy doing on stage telling us about this topic? And then it had to become longer. So it's 35 minutes. And then our relationship deepened. So then now what you're about to experience in Montreal is a 60, 70-minute version of this piece, which is also meta in the sense that it details some of the inflection points that got us to the piece that you'll experience.
That's so beautiful. It's like it was this living thing that has like changed in the 8 years. I mean, was that when you first started it in 2016, or that's sort of when the seed was planted?
Yeah, the seed was planted, yeah, probably 2015, 16. And we started doing that 10-minute piece in 2016.
Oh,
And
okay. So it was like immediately after.
pretty much. Yeah, and that's the other thing, we were moving with a sense of urgency that was felt possible and important. Uh, and it was just kind of come hell or high water, we've got to get this out there. I really look back. It's been 8 years, and I definitely look back. The most empathy that I have, actually, looking back, is with Vanessa and BZ. Like, we were all younger people then. Vanessa and BZ were young people in their early 20s. All of us were in our early 20s when we'd started this project. And they were taking incredible um, personal risk and taking lots of effort to become these voices for their community and taking up the torch from an older generation to become the faces of this community. Um, and looking back, it's just so powerful. I think that I'm really glad that we were able to get this show off the ground because their story, it just, as I get older, it touches me really deeply in a way that it wasn't the same relationship before. Um, yeah.
And where has the production been shown up to date?
Yeah. So this is actually our 20th theater in 7 years, which is really exciting. So we've
Oh
done a lot of
wow.
Ontario. Yeah. We've been to BC. We've also been to Germany, actually. And yeah, it's our first time in Quebec, though. So it'll be really exciting to engage with the city of Montreal. Yeah, what was interesting was that festival. What's really exciting is that programmer, Martine, is now at FTA, which is a performing arts festival in Montreal. But Martine at that year was curating a festival, an arts festival that was interrogating Germany's colonial history. And one of the last pieces that Martine brought to the festival was ours, because Martine, I hope I'm conveying this accurately, but she said, we'd curated a lot of the stuff way in advance, and we realized there was a gap. We were looking for a company, artists, from the perspective of the colonizing culture engaging with the topic today, and here we were as like nobody, we were nobody, and we're still nobodies, but like back then we were really nobodies, like there's here's this artistic director saying, oh, this show has a voice and has a place in this conversation to complexify it and to bring it home for our audience here. It it's interesting that it's taken so long for Canadian presenters to one, find us, trust us, and bring us in, right? So I found that all very interesting, for sure.
Why do you think that is, for Canadian production companies and Canadian theater as a whole to bring this in and accept this?
Um, it's gotten easier over time. I definitely think that in terms of form, we've gotten more open to the type of form that we're playing with. For example, we went to this regional theater company called Great Canadian Theater Company, and that was 2 years ago. And what I loved was the audience that typically went to their shows came in to the theater. And I talked to people before the show, and they were like, "Oh wow, like there's nothing here. There's no set, like there's a table and a chair." And then after the show, they'd be like, "Oh wow, I didn't expect that the experience would get so full because we have video projections and audio and all this stuff." With that little stuff on stage. So one, there's a kind of how it looks from the outside in terms of it looks like a really small thing, but I think experientially it's very large. Um, and I think the other thing is it's a bit risky. I mean, it sounds heavy. Maybe people think it's hard to sell. Maybe. Maybe if we picked a more lighthearted title, more people would be coming out. I don't know. Um, but I think it's also that with the distance that that German presenter, it's the distance of not being in the ecosystem that makes it little less risky. I think that actually it does take some risk to present this show. It, and part of the risk could come from people who don't watch it at all and form an opinion before they've seen it. Um, More and more, I feel that we are in a place as a society, I hope, in which we're able to engage in these conversations and have a little bit more facility with these topics. But the show started before there was a, Orange Shirt Day. There wasn't a National Day of Truth and Rec. Like that all that stuff came in this 8 years. So we've also seen the country change as we've continued to do it, which is also why we keep updating it every time.
Right, and perhaps there's like a higher level of willingness to engage as well, and interest and kind of responsibility to learn.
Exactly, exactly,
Hmm.
yeah, and I'm hopeful for that. Yeah, I'm really
Hmm.
hopeful.
Mm. What do you hope for audiences in Montreal to gain out of this show?
Yeah, often think of our work as I mentioned before, it's speaking to an already informed audience or mostly informed audience. Um, I see folks that are informed as often feeling like they're on the precipice of taking action. They're just on the edge of doing that thing, but maybe they don't know what that thing is or they don't have that little push. I always think of our audience members as they're right here, and then our job is to go boop, and so that's what I hope for them, to just take it that one step farther. Vanessa and BZ's story is so inspiring for me, anyways, and And I hope that that also continues to keep that fire alive in anybody who's curious about these topics, or in whatever work that they're doing for social change and
Hmm.
progress.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin, for chatting with me. This has been delightful, and sharing a bit about your experience in Chemical Valley Project.
Oh, thanks. It's totally my pleasure, Neha. Thank you so much for having me here.
Of course, absolutely.